Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to be going through Toome Road today, and what I'm going to do is begin with some context. Then I'm going to look at the poem and focus a lot on language, form and structure, a lot on structure and form. And as I'm doing that, in purple, I've put down how I'm going to link to some of the different poems, okay? I want you all to take notes as I do that, and at the end of this presentation, I want you to add some things, and I want you to challenge me on anything that you think I got wrong. So I'm going to begin up here with my context. This poem is from Fieldwork, which was published when Heaney has moved to Dublin. It's part of a biographical information where we might want to say that he's tried to get away from the Troubles. This collection doesn't deal with the Troubles nearly as much as North. And there are a lot of nationalist people who are very critical of Heaney at this time. However, Toome Road is a highly political poem, and I'm going to give you a little bit of context that I think is really important. Toome Road is where Roddy Macaulay is buried, and I believe in the 19th century they erected a tomb or a monument to Roddy Macaulay on the Toome Road, okay? Now, who was Roddy Macaulay? Roddy Macaulay was a Protestant, a Presbyterian, who fought for a united Ireland. And he was caught in 1800, and he was hanged in this area by the perfidious British, who chopped him into bits and buried him in the road. And then later, his relatives had his body excavated, and he was buried properly with this monument. I think that's really important context when we think about what this poem's about. A further thing would be the pun on tomb. Now, in terms of the English pronunciation, we might think of a tomb or a funeral, and there is some kind of burial imagery that goes through this poem, okay? So now, beginning with the poem itself. One morning, early, I met armoured cars. Two things about the opening. One, I've called it a quotidian opening, an everyday opening. It's something extraordinary which is related to us in a kind of matter-of-fact, colloquial way, as though it's not significant. Now, there's some sort of debate about the form of this poem. Is it from the perspective of a child? Heaney does tell us in an interview that he had an occasion in the Second World War when he saw Allied troops preparing for the Normandy invasion, and it was a similar scene to this. But if we look at things like the idea of charioteers there, that seems to be a reference to the charioteer British tank, which seems to locate it more in the Troubles. I guess the answer is that it's neither and both of them. That what he's looking at is a long history of invasions of this nature that have occurred throughout Irish history. As we know, 1,000 years of invasions and colonization. The alternative to a child might be that it's from the perspective of a farmer, because in some ways it does actually seem quite adult-like in places. Once again, we don't have to answer, is it one or the other? It could be a merging of the two, because this is something that is replicated throughout Irish history. It says, I met armoured cars in a convoy. We're going to have a lot of this military language. We've got two different lexical and semantic fields here. We have a military and a pastoral one that conflict and merge and are juxtaposed. We've got powerful tyres here, the military one, and then we've got, interestingly, warbling, which is a very interesting term here. It's a beautiful verb that sounds bird-like and song-like, isn't it? It doesn't belong with that military description whatsoever. It seems to belong in the other field of the poem, the pastoral one. I read online as well that and this seems a little bit fanciful to me, that they have a warble fly, which is a kind of parasitic fly that can actually insert itself under the flesh of livestock. Is that a little bit fanciful, maybe? I don't know, because it would depend on what Irish readers would make of it, I suppose, given that Heaney is writing for that audience mainly. Now we notice that these military trucks, which are juxtaposed with the pastoral, actually take the branches from the pastoral. Notice that they are broken older branches, which then camouflage the soldiers. So it's like they're cannibalizing the land. And this seems to be part of this theme of colonization, exploitation. There's something so awful and terrible about the fact that nature has been destroyed so that they can become a more effective fighting machine. So in terms of linking poems, I think we can link to punishment, as I say here. We can link on the theme of violence, but there is also a contrast in punishment between a softness and a vulnerability and a hardness of the ritualistic punishment. So we've got a beautiful interplay. So if you wanted to link in terms of structure, I think it would be about the juxtaposition of the hard and the soft with, ossification and flesh. In this case, it's nature and military. Not only are the soldiers cannibalizing nature, breaking the branches off, they are also headphoned. And anyone will know, as a teacher, I despise seeing students walking around with headphones. Why? Because you are insulating yourself from the outside world, aren't you? Now, let's not forget, in Heaney's time, we didn't have AirPods. So seeing headphone people was far, far more infrequent. What did it mean? It meant that they were dead to the sounds around them, the sounds of the countryside. Instead, they're communicating with each other. I think that this is beautiful symbolism for the way in which the soldiers are imports from Britain. They're not there. They are the outsiders, and Heaney is the insider. Here they are with their horrible sibilant S's, soldiers standing, and notice the hard consonants of the T's, turrets. So we have these hard sounds that seem to contrast with the much softer sounds of the countryside. Fields, slates, chill gates, silos, all of that asyndetic listing that shows the items of the countryside that are so familiar to our speaker and how they contrast with the unfamiliarity of the military hardware, of the militaristic soldiers, etc. Now a lot of this poem concerns questions. How long were they approaching? And we have a question. Later on, whom shall I tell? Who? So there's a lot of these interrogatives. Now, the tone of these is interesting. Is this a kind of imploring despair? Or is this a demanding and anger? Now, unfortunately, I couldn't find a reading of the poem by Heaney, but I would suggest that the poem works with either tone. And it depends on what you want the message of the poem to be. Do you want it to be an interrogative, anti-colonial demand for action and stating the authenticity of your land and how you want these invaders to go? Or do you want it alternatively to be a criticism of your own people? Because I think that reading is also available. Because he says, how long were they approaching down my roads? And these personal pronouns are very important, aren't they? This assertion of ownership. Again, I would be looking to link to the poem New Song, which is about reclaiming land and the river overflowing on a linguistic and a kind of geological, topographical way, that Ireland is becoming Irish again. This seems to link again with who owns the land, who has the right to be there. I think it also links to Act of Union, which we're going to look at in a lot more detail next lesson. Again, this idea of invasion and taking land, rape, and the whole Irish Ashling tradition of seeing the land as feminine and as violated. So the soldiers act like they own them. And our speaker's confused because this is his landscape. And these people, he can't understand why they have such an assured sense of ownership over his own land. So, of course, in terms of theme, we want to link to colonialism, to imperialism, to invasion, to violence, and all of these other things. But here's the bit that's a little bit more complex. The whole country was sleeping. Now again, what does this mean? Is it symbolic of the fact that the people are walking into a kind of domination, that they should be resistant, that they are completely unaware of what's happening around them? Is he angry at their lack of resistance? Or is he emphasizing the fact that they are defenseless, that they're in their beds as this military hardware rolls over the country roads and doesn't belong there? There's no real answer to that other than to sort of emphasize the ambiguity of it. And here, as I said before, we have this listing where he talks about fields, cattle in my keeping. Again, this is where it doesn't seem like the perspective of a child, does it? Here we've got the perspective of a farmer who has agricultural eyes. And there's something holy and sacred about food suppliers, isn't there? That goes back to Rome and the pastoral tradition and the idea of the sacredness of being a farmer and being a food producer and the honorableness of that. And that explains why he seems so outraged that his food making would be interrupted by this military invasion that he can't really comprehend. He talks about tractors and buck rakes in open sheds, silos, chill gates, wet slats, the reds and the greens. So these are the symbols of home. These are the symbols and signs of home in the countryside. And we've said before, the invasion contrasts with that so sharply. The brokenness, the camouflage, the tires, the convoy, the armored cars. And then he goes on to say, whom should I run to tell among all of those with their back doors on the latch? Well, famously in the past in the Irish countryside, people would not latch their doors. So I think that in itself is symbolic, isn't it, of the levels of fear that people are now closing their doors. Notice it's their back doors. They fear things. So what is happening around us in the present, we have the murders, don't we, and the bodies being buried in the countryside in Ireland. We have the troubles that are spilling over into the south of the border, into southern Ireland too. So we see this kind of pervasive fear. Now, is it the case that Heaney is saying that the people aren't resistant, that they should get up, that they should unlatch their doors and confront these soldiers, etc.? He seems to be saying that because he says that they've closed their doors against the bringer of bad news. Is he the bringer of bad news? Is he saying that people aren't listening to his poetry, that people are blind to the troubles? Well, that could be one very powerful reading. And he goes on to say, you'll notice one thing I haven't mentioned is the éjamment and how it works. Earlier we have the éjamment using the remorseless rolling of the tanks as they move forward. And then we have the endless questions. Then we have the éjamment that works on this asynthetic listing, where we have all of the items of the countryside. And now we have more éjamment where he's asking questions, where he's puzzled, where he's searching for answers. And he says, for the bringer of the bad news, that small hour's visitant, who, and notice all the caesura here, by being expected, might be kept distant. What does he mean by that? He seems to suggest, like the idea in the old days, that the messenger, you don't necessarily kill the messenger, but here you do not want to hear the messenger. So if we're going to link to something like North and the idea of the nub treasure and the importance of using art to communicate, here the art doesn't seem to be working, does it? You know, there seems to be quite a lot of implicit criticism there. And he goes on to say, this is an odd line that belongs alone. Sowers of seed, erectors of headstones. Well, have a look at this. We've got 14 lines to here, so we basically have a sonnet. And that could be the end of the poem. we could have, if we look at it, a kind of octave sestet thing going on there. So in terms of form, I would very much be looking to compare this to Requiem. Yeah? And I think that that's a really nice one, because we can compare it not only in terms of form, but ideas of resistance, the ideas of a pastoral people being overwhelmed by military force, by a colonial power, but still retaining the idea of fighting back over time. So I think that's a beautiful comparison that you could make. But what does he mean by this one line that I think belongs on its own? Sowers of seed, erectors of headstones. Is that a criticism? Does it mean that they're blind? It's hard to say, because sowers of seed is a very positive thing. It's people who grow things, people who grow food. And we've got all this beauty of the countryside. Erectors of headstones. Does that mean people who just bury their dead? Does that mean people who live in history in the past, who just look at the legacy and their ancestors? Or does that mean people who actually respect their past? If it's the latter, then I think we can link to bogland and the power of history to resist colonialism. The great Irish elk and the bog butter that withstands time, and the fact that the earth keeps crusting, keeps changing. And when you look long term, then the oppression of the present isn't so bad. It can disappear and go away. And history and mythology becomes an amazing form of resistance. And you can resist the colonizers by looking at the power of your stories. And we see that again in Anahorish. And what does the Irish language represent? And place names. It represents this kind of prehistory to colonialism, where you can re-find your mythology and your language, and you can re-find your stories, and you can write out the colonial history. And for the kind of nub treasure idea, that's what the artists can do then. They can draw upon this incredible reservoir of narrative and stories and words, and they can resist what is, trying to write over their culture. Of course, the same would be for New Song, where the river and erotica and the Irish language seem to merge into a flooding in which you could overtake the old Anglo-Norman domain. Do we remember that in the poem? And we can sort of break down the barriers and the boundaries that have been put in. Remember when the British, the Anglo-Normans came over, they called these plantations. This is before the West Indies and the United States. So the first plantations were in Ireland. And this poem seems to link to this kind of idea that Ireland remains a kind of plantation. So, if we left that as a sonnet, and we hadn't added the last tercet, these beautiful 3 lines over here, we would have a very different poem, wouldn't we? We would have a poem which is largely one of resignation, a small countryside place, a pastoral place, unable to resist this horrible colonial invasion. But Heaney adds this tercet to the sonnet. And notice the change in diction. "O charioteers," he says. This is what Latin people call a vocative, where you address your reader. So here he's addressing the British troops, and he's punning on the idea of the tanks being charioteers. This is a form of tank. And also that they are like Roman legions. So this is a kind of resistance poem. And he's kind of using an epic classical diction, and he's doing so not only to make the British seem grander, but to also make his own culture seem grander. And that's where it gets really interesting. "Above your dormant guns," you're not using your guns at the moment, they're sleeping. But dormant doesn't mean dead. It means that it could come back at any moment. "It stands here." Notice we don't know what the it is. What is this it? This thing that will resist these charioteers, these tanks. vibrant. Now the word vibrant is really interesting, isn't it? Because it means alive, it means moving as you pass. The invisible. So it stands here, it has a kind of material reality, and yet it is invisible. It is historical, yet it is vibrant, and it is untoppled. The Omphalos, which is the great stone at the Oracle of Delphi, where, according to Greek mythology, Zeus placed the stone at the center of the world, and that's why it became the most important mythological place on earth, apart from, Mount Olympus where the gods lived. And you would go to the Oracle of Delphi to find out the future, would you not? So it's an incredibly powerful mythological symbol. So notice here, this tercet then completely reverses the direction of the poem. And it becomes much more one of defiance. So why would we not link it to Bog Queen? Bog Queen who was, defeated, badly treated, etc. And we know that we have that description of her being kind of metaphorically raped, etc. But she rises, doesn't she? Like the return of the repressed, like the anger of the Irish, etc. Of course, we could also link to Requiem here. So this then, therefore, becomes a poem not of resignation, but rather a poem of resistance and defiance. So just to finish off now, which big themes can I see? Obviously, invasion, violence, mythology, artistry, history, vulnerability,